Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I'm preparing to check in on my so-called original red wiggler worms. And the bins that house those worms are down here in the lower row, lower shelf. The two bins off to your left. Everything else is older as you kind of follow this way, and then as you make your way off to the right, those are all my younger systems. So these are among my older bins, and these two original red wiggler worm bins are now 185 days of age, and they've been fed 16 times so far. If I look at some of my older systems, I believe over there, that system was fed 21 times. I believe up here, these African nightcrawler systems have been fed 24 times. So at 16 feedings, they've got a little bit of catching up to do before they kind of get to that age where I would start trying to gear them up for kind of harvest and for relocating the worms. I mean, as far as the older systems go, with the African nightcrawlers, I had already started into the migration of the worms out of the systems, and then I kind of did a flipperoo on that idea, and I decided to bring them back to regular composting. Similarly, with this bin of red wigglers, I started into the foraging phase, and then I had a change of heart, and I got back into active composting there too. So here, I think we're just going to continue on with composting. Even though last time we did do something I had mentioned over here on the board, you might have noticed it said that we transitioned them to small particle size food, which would lend itself to having some really nice clean castings and paving the way to harvest. I'm not sure that that's going to stick for much longer, especially if we're going to do another couple feedings in here, but those are the bins we're going to take care of getting fed today. Again, we're going to stick to that small particle size feeding approach. So let's get them up onto the bench and get them fed. So what I mean by small particle size is what you see here. Over here is this ground up corn on the cob. Over here in the carton you'll see some coffee, and this is my worm chow. So that's kind of what I meant by small particle size foods. All stuff that I doubt we're going to see any leftovers of here today. And I guess the other thing besides being small particle size, it's not juicy in any way. So it's not going to bring with it any moisture for the most part. If it does, it's very, very little. So I think that's also going to kind of help drive the system towards the point where we're going to have a bunch of nice, smooth flowing castings. There's a lot of castings right there on top of that top covering newspaper. This one too, perhaps not quite as much. Look at that, we've got ourselves a little tomato garden growing. So even the last time we fed with stuff that had no seeds, or at least no seeds that would be recognizable as seeds. I mean, my worm chow was pretty much all pumpkin seeds for the most part. Maybe a little bit of bird seed too. I don't remember exactly what I made it from this time. But I guess the feeding prior must have consisted of some of the tomatoes that I bought in from my garden immediately prior to the first frost arriving. And it looks like even though they're not quite as large, we've got a similar little crop growing over here. It does seem like the worms are pretty into hanging out down there amongst the roots of those newly germinated little tomato plants. And even though they're hanging out in the roots, they don't touch anything that's growing. They might be hanging out there, but they're not disturbing the plants. They're composting worms, right? So they're only going to be interested in feeding on material that's already in the process of decomposition. So I think that those plants could have easily just continued to grow to mature tomato plants if we had just left them, but that's not the reason we're putting tomato into these bins to try to grow their seeds. We put the tomato in there to feed the worms. And it looks like we're even bumping into some leftovers. Huh. Very unusual to find a tomato that hasn't even been breached. Perhaps the skin was never broken, and perhaps the worms never even succeeded in accessing the contents of this piece of fruit. I mean, at this point, there is juices spilling out of it. The skin was definitely fragile enough that it only required a little bit of my manhandling to burst the skin and allow the juices to come spilling out. That was a little bit surprising, I got to admit, considering it's probably been, what was it, 12 days interval between the past 2 feedings, and then another 10 days between this feeding and, wow, another tomato. Gosh. Even though I was kind of under the impression that we're now going to go into the feeding zone and possibly see no signs of any of the foods that they got last time, it seems like I'm being proven wrong here. You know, unless I'm totally mixing this. Yeah, you know, I don't even know. Maybe I'm just totally getting mixed up here, but it does seem kind of unusual to come in here and find all this stuff. I mean, we may have found those as leftovers last time, repositioned them down in the feeding area, and then applied the feeding that we applied last time, which was all that small particle size stuff, and assumed that the stuff would just continue breaking down. I mean, if anything, you would expect to find a tomato that's been discovered by the worms to look more like this, where the majority of the juicy, meaty part of it has been nibbled out, leaving kind of just the skin, which will also get consumed eventually, but that takes them a little bit longer to take care of. And look at all these leaf stems. Leaves are usually a pretty popular bedding element in my systems, and I must have applied some of that stuff pretty recently for it to be out here in this material in such great quantities. So I guess I'm sort of refamiliarizing myself with what went down in this bin. I think I did sort of rewatch the video from the last check-in 10 days ago, but I must have just really breezed through it and just looked at the description that made reference to the small particle size stuff that they were fed last time, and then sort of completely overlooked the fact that we had some tomato in here. So let's do a similar excavation over here in bin number 2 of the feeding area to see what we have in store for us here. I'm kind of guessing that since these are systems that have been kind of managed together over their lifetime, we're going to find very similar stuff. And here too, you can kind of tell when you're holding on to something that the worms have not yet managed to break through the skin of, because you kind of give it a little squeeze and then the surface of the material gets really taut like a balloon, and it's still holding pressure. So I think that's got to end. We got to just breach the skin on these bits of fruit so that the worms can gain access. So if we encounter anything else, perhaps even this tomato over here might be the same story. So let's just make sure we kind of expose the insides of these leftovers to worm traffic, because it's not about allowing the stuff to last forever in the worm bin. It's quite the opposite. You want to see the stuff get consumed and done away with. So I'm really surprised to see so many leftovers. I was just kind of not expecting that, so I'm sort of adapting to the observations that we're making here as we go through. Gosh, it even makes me wonder if perhaps these tomatoes were still green when we put them in here and they've ripened down here within the systems. I don't know, I'm not sure. Makes me want to go back and review the video a little bit more carefully from the last check-in to see what the heck really happened in here last time. This was one thing that I did expect to find as leftovers. Some of the coffee filter that we laid in right beneath the small particle size food that we gave them last time. But other than that, I really didn't expect to be encountering all this stuff that we're finding in here. Yet another pretty good sized juicy tomato. Well, right when I thought we weren't going to be dealing with anything juicy in here for much longer, I'm once again surprised. The worm bins always somehow manage to surprise me. I don't know why. Perhaps I'm just not paying close enough attention to what's going on. Yeah, a lot of worm activity here, and I assume now that we're dealing with a bunch of freshly exposed juicy material from those tomatoes, we're probably going to see even more worm activity coming out to indulge in all that juiciness. And another tomato which might not have been breached yet, so we just give it a little squeeze and expose its insides to the worms. And anything damp, anything moist, you got to assume that the worms are going to just go for it. Alright, so let's proceed to giving them their food. Following my customary approach, we're going to just restore anything we encountered along the way back down into the feeding area. Return all the leftovers down into the pit where they can just continue on with that stuff. Did we get it all? I think we did for the most part. Same story over here. Drop in all these leftover bits of tomato and whatever this was. Is this a tomato too? I believe it is. Just definitely a very green one. I can recognize it from the look of its seeds. And this one definitely looks more like you would expect a tomato to look after being in a worm bin for now, let's see, 12 days, another 10 days, more than 3 weeks, if not longer. So that's all the leftovers going right back in. And you know, all these leaf stems, they're going to take some time too. So I don't know. I mean, we might have another flip-flop in approach, which I've been known to do from time to time, especially in the past few check-ins of a few of my systems. I've been coming in here and sort of reversing course on a number of my systems, taking them out of foraging, returning them to regular feedings, even taking them out of migration and returning them to regular feedings. And here, maybe it is a good idea to just sort of stay the course and stick to giving them stuff that's not going to bring with it much moisture or much slow composting elements, so they can really continue working down some of these slower composting bits of leaf stem, mainly leaf stem. Here's like the stem of a tomato, I assume is what that is. That might actually outlive the rest of everything in the systems. So I think we're done feeding. We're going to use the covering up of the feeding zones now. Oops, I just spilled a bunch over the edge. We're going to use that as our excuse to come in here and sort of till up the outer edges and see how things look out there too. Here, look at this big chunk of paper. Kind of makes me want to get it right down where the action's going to be in the feeding zone. Whole bunch of leafy matter. So these systems definitely appear to have a good bit of work to do before we end up with a batch of harvestable castings material. But I think by continuing to feed them with things that are not going to leave behind all kinds of remnants and leftovers, we'll eventually end up with some really awesome stuff. Looks like here too we've managed to bump into another piece of coffee filter. It's kind of weird. I just kind of expected to find coffee filters right down the middle where we last fed. Although, I don't know. Maybe I just wasn't paying close enough attention. I was just like on the tip of my tongue. I was going to say the worms did something sneaky there to sort of surprise me, but you know that's not really possible. I mean, it is possible that they do it, but I don't think they would do it consciously. Should I say it out loud? Maybe you're thinking the same thing. Could the worms have actually taken 2 coffee filters from the middle and moved them to the edge? Seems almost impossible. But that was, for whatever reason, what entered my mind there for a moment. Call me crazy. All right. I feel good that we've managed to stir up all the material in these bins and get everything nicely aerated, get a chance to see that everything's looking good, get a real reality check on, you know, how the material in both of these systems looks in terms of how close it is to possibly gearing them up for possibly migration, possibly for harvest. But I do believe that we're quite away from having that being the case in these systems. So now what I'm bumping into over here on this edge closest to me is really what I was sort of expecting. A whole bunch of pretty heavily broken down material with a minimum amount of residue and bits and pieces of stuff floating around in it. That's kind of somehow what I thought that the entire system is made up of, but I was proven wrong again by the worms, which is something that seems to happen pretty regularly when you're a worm farmer. It's not just me. The worms somehow always manage to throw a curveball at you. But maybe the curveball is self-induced. Maybe I just wasn't paying close enough attention to what I was doing. All right, one more edge of a bin to be inspected and we're finished. Luckily our feeding zone indicators from last time have held up well enough to be reused, because even though I fed coffee today, it was coffee that didn't include coffee filters. And the top covering newspapers are also holding up quite nicely. Over here on this edge of this bin too, I'm finding much the same, whole bunch of really nicely broken down material. All I'm doing is just stirring it up a little bit and combining other stuff into it, anything that's sort of floating around here on the top. And now it does feel to me like, with the exception of what's down the middle, which is where we just fed and where we returned some leftovers to, we've got some pretty nicely blended material throughout both systems. And I mean, if I had to just guess how long it would take for what's in both of these systems to really make it to the finish line, I bet you it would take probably a couple months, you know. It's hard to say for sure how long that would take, because all those stems, really, I am probably referring more to the stems. I think it would probably take a couple of months before we can, you know, look into these systems and find pretty much none of these leaf stems, but some of them are really big, clearly evidence of the fact that we must have entered, you know, must have put them into the system, both systems, pretty recently. And I think that is the case, you know, because even 2 feedings ago, I believe what we were actually doing was applying a top coating of fresh leaves, which always looks nice, but in older systems it could end up, you know, undoing the potential of the systems being harvested soon, especially if you would really prefer to see all that stuff neatly broken down before you venture into the realm of migrating the worms out and harvesting their castings. So I think from this point forward we might very well continue down the road of including only materials that would pretty quickly break down, small particle size stuff, and then at some point, perhaps a few feedings from now, start thinking about the possibility of getting these worms relocated, getting them out of their castings and moving them onto green pastures. But for now, we're definitely still in active composting mode here in these bins. Who knows, we might even switcheroo and not come back the next time with small particle stuff. Maybe we'll just go right back to some sort of large chunk of kitchen scraps. But for now, that's it for our check-in with the wormies. And not just any wormies, my original red wiggler wormies. 185 days and going strong. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Hopefully enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.